Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and today on Game Master's Toolbox, I'm going to be revealing about 10 or so of the major resources that I use for coming up with stories. With 50 years of experience, 50 years of sitting in front of a group and having to come up with new stories, I've developed a bunch of different resources that I utilize to come up with new twists on story elements and new ways to tell those tales. And today I'm going to be sharing that with you. If you would, go down below and press all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and we'll get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about these resources, these untapped treasure troves of ideas that I've gleaned and groomed and utilized throughout the time that I've been a storyteller to make sure that the stories are always drawing players in and captivating them with the direction so that they then pick up the story threads and run with them, building this tapestry of adventure and exciting conditions that are, I wouldn't say they're not reproducible, but I do believe that the elements of opportunity that I'm going to be providing will give you enough resource that every adventure that you make throughout your career as a game master will be virtually impossible to run out of ideas. And so let's get to the first one. Okay, so when we're doing role-play games, it's obvious and it's almost a trope to say you're going to retell the stories that you're familiar with in new and interesting ways. And one of the major resources, of course, would be the stories that you listened to when you were younger. I got an early start at being a game master at 11, and when you're that early in your development, you're going to be leaning heavily upon the stories that already exist in the genre. So the concepts of fairy tales and the various children's stories that were about, for example, the stories of King Arthur and such, are an obvious source for the adventure material. Even if you couch them differently and put the players in different situations or conditions than they would be otherwise, you can emulate the pieces of the stories that you've heard and therefore tap into the subconscious of your players so that they will feel the emotions that you're trying to get across and therefore will respond with their interpretations of it as well. This doesn't mean that you get specifically tied to a certain genre of stories. Aesop's Fables is another great source, Greek mythology, and so on. But these different familiar tropic piles of information are a great way to draw from to create the inspiration to make your own stories really stand out. The concept of, for example, creating non-player characters, or what I prefer to use the non-enjoined persons, is easier when you're able to draw from your own personal memory of a person that you are emulating or trying to bring that personality into the story. Some people can do great voices and inflections, and others have to draw upon other methodologies for getting across the individuality of the non-enjoined persons that the players are going to interact with, and the idea of therefore drawing from your own cultural memories of the NPCs that you read about. The essential characters in a story are not necessarily the essential characters from a literary standpoint, but how they affected your understanding of the story. second source and pretty close to magic are the science fiction and techno thrillers that we read. One of the things that I believe it was Arthur Clarke said, that the more sophisticated technology becomes, the more akin it is to magic in the minds of many, because if they can't comprehend of it in terms of its technology, then they naturally will lend it a mystic or mythic characteristic. And therefore, the stories that we read in the techno thriller environment are actually really good fodder for creating the sophistication, for example, of criminal organizations, or the nemesis factor, whoever it is that's involving their business with the characters in the game. And these elements can become rather sophisticated. So drawing upon the cultural identity of, for example, nation states and such in a role-playing environment really builds in places for the mystic things to fundamentally be those that are actually technological. The real advantage, therefore, is that the stories that we find in science fiction or technology can be utilized in our fantasy stories as well, if we just simply look through the lens of the fantastic. A surprising source for particularly really good drama sets and such come from the more classic romance novels, or what are called collectively the chick flick, the idea of the motion picture that does not necessarily have a huge martial aspect, but instead has a dramatic interaction, perhaps even Byzantine in levels because of the Regency storylines and such. These tend to draw the players into an interconnection with the story in a deeper way than they might otherwise. And utilizing the mechanisms of Nikos RPG, for example, you can actually play out your dramatic or even the para-romantic scenes utilizing die rolling mechanisms that are actually built for that purpose, and you have a means to play through that level of direct connection. And by expanding your circle of resource to areas that perhaps are not necessarily directly comfortable to you, you actually can therefore build up your own capacity for building sophisticated and multidimensional personas for the specifics of engaging in a roleplay game. Of course, with the way our world is going right now, there's quite a bit of information that you can pull on, whether it be national conflicts and the interaction between nation states, whether it be the rise or fall of an empire, whether or not you're talking about the expansion and liberation of those that have been oppressed. All of these are definitely elements that you can bring into your game right from the headlines. Just simply change the names and change the elements, and suddenly you have your own story now flowing in a way that will feel pertinent to your players, because these tropes, these themes that are found in actual real life stories sometimes are stranger than the fiction that we would want to create around them. When you're talking about role-playing games and the drama of adventure, you inevitably come back around to the idea of mystery, and whether it be a multi-dimensional, terror-driven psychological thriller along the lines of H.P. Lovecraft, or it be a simple bait and switch going on because of a local manipulator trying to change the pecking order in a local community, the idea of the Scooby-Doos and Nancy Drews types of stories become really apparent. And if you're unfamiliar with either of the terms, of course, Scooby-Doo is a cartoon character from a television show that started in the 70s and still has remained relevant from time to time, ebbing and flowing with everything else. But Nancy Drews, Hardy Boys, the idea of these were books that were written for the teen mind, and were like opening up potential for these concepts of being intellectually aware and sophisticated. And these were, of course, since they were written for youth, the storylines are simple, and they make for great one-shot adventures in a role-playing environment, because you're able to build in the same elements of the mystery while adding in also perhaps direct conflict and fight scenes and things like that that the players would be wanting to look for. Of course, we wouldn't be covering the gamut if we didn't also include the idea of the slasher film and the creature features, the actual physical monsters. Whether you've seen them on television or you've read them in books, the idea of the deeply intense, manic nature of a slasher film, or the perhaps more subtle and circumspect monster movies or creature features. If in these terms, I'm referring to, for example, the werewolf story themes or vampire story themes. The idea of Spring-Heeled Jack or Jack the Ripper, or any of the modern slashers like Freddy. The idea is that these tropic things also do set up a process for a paralinear adventure, where you are allowing the players to investigate and potentially identify who the villain is, while keeping the drama and the combat side vibrant as well. And of course, you can't go wrong with the classics. And when I speak of the Bible or other religious works, the drama and the spectacle of the interactions that are demonstrated in these holy works also are opportunities for there to be variations on a theme that can be included in your game system. If you are using deity, of course, there's the obvious one-to-one relationship, but even for an adventurer that is not so much in that direction, for example, many of the cosmic horror stories could be resolved by building in the very concept that these holy works actually have in-game relevance, and pulling on the strings of those who would seek to know the lore and the reality of that material. You open up a floodgate for potential creativity on your own part by weaving the personas and identities found in these holy writs with individual players. Now, certain documents are off limits in terms of playing. The idea that our creativity is limited by an external source, as it would be, there are people who would find that to be a taboo and be against it, and that's their prerogative. But if you are building a story yourself and know these tales, there's no reason why you couldn't draw on the themes of them at the very least. All right, now in the American history books, there was a period of time where marketers determined that they could move the public through the medium of the written word or advertising, and started to build the concepts of the tall tales, twisted myths, and other story elements that would bring to mind familiar themes and therefore convince people to perhaps buy a product of a certain nature. Well, this also applies in terms of building out a story. You can certainly draw upon these tall tales and these thematic elements so that your players can feel themselves being bigger than life, or interacting at this ultimately meta story level. And these resources are not as prevalent as they used to be, and you pretty much have to look beyond to see them. But even in the modern realm, there's a lot of story themes that are based on these ancient tales, and perhaps look at them through a alternate framework, which therefore gives you the ability to create these twisted myths on your own for your own purposes. Ocean's 11. It was when I was watching Ocean's 11 and had just recently watched The Usual Suspects that the idea of utilizing a ensemble cast mentality with your role play game struck me. Granted, everybody has always had the elements of in their story where their games group works together to accomplish something, but the idea of each of them having their moment to shine within the story is really promoted when you look at these ensemble cast movies. When you are looking at 5, 6, 7 characters, each pursuing their own agenda, but working collectively to accomplish. That's really what role-play games are all about. So the idea of drawing upon any of the ensemble cast films, whether it be Stalag 17, or, as I mentioned before, Ocean's 11, or even smaller cast movies like Secondhand Lions, there is a way to draw the player's interaction and make it a part of that larger story that's being told, so that everyone that's at the table can really appreciate how the other characters weave into their own personal stories. But my secret weapon, one of these that I don't, it's partially a guilty pleasure of mine, but it's also a really powerful, useful tool, is the vintage cop shows from the 70s, 80s. And it wasn't just the fringe ones like Knight Rider, who obviously had a mythic element in the use of his AI car, but the idea that the team-ups and the drama that gets involved as you interweave the real lives of the characters with the stories of which they are a part, it's a treasure trove. There, you literally could watch all the episodes of Kojak or all the episodes of Columbo and have dozens and dozens of storylines just percolate in your head immediately, because these characters are working through basically the equivalent of one-shots, because you have an episodic show, and each show you want to have a complete encapsulated story. Man, you could literally just almost lift the entire script of one or any of these and allow the players to play through them, and therefore create the very elements of an ongoing story. As a matter of fact, this is fundamentally the best way to build a long-form campaign, is to run dozens and dozens of singletons, and then as you are viewing them in retrospect, you can start to see how they link up and line up to make a greater, longer, deeper story just by weaving the elements of all of these different resources together. So there's my secret. I actually pull from all of these sources, and so my question back to you would be, what is it that's your secret? What are your resources that help you build out the stories that you have, that you're going to share with your players? And how do you do so? What is it that you draw upon? Are there personalities? Are there voices, for example? Is there a certain theme or tone? Let us know. Share in the discussion below in the comment section, so we can all be a part of that. I will be doing other episodes of these where we actually talk about how to weave. That's itself is a kind of a arcane science of how to draw threads together. So we'll talk about that in a new episode in the near future. And tell me if there's any particular portion of these you would like me to explore further. Would you like me to give you additional mechanisms on how to draw these pieces together, or are you looking for even more resources? I'll be glad to help in either way. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been Nikos RPG, and remember, we're on basically 5 days a week, and I will see you in the next one. Oh, and don't forget, Grandpa says,